This is Erskine Veterans Radio, and joining us this week to talk to us about some of the work that they've done in the past and some of the involvement they have with the charity is one of our new ambassadors, and it's somebody you'll certainly recognise the face and I assume the voice of as well, because he's been a newspaper, radio and television journalist for 40 years, the nightly face of the Scottish news on STV for more than a quarter of a century. And on top of that, an officer in the Army Reserve since 1994 and served in operations in both Iraq and Afghanistan. And is now the latest ambassador to be added to the Erskine Veteran Charity. And he's going to tell us all about all of his previous work and how he's looking forward to being more involved with Erskine over the coming months and years. And my great pleasure to welcome to Erskine Veterans Radio, Mike Edwards. Hello, Mike.
Hello, Ian. How are you?
I'm great, yes, and great to have you on the show. First, a very warm welcome to the Erskine Charity as an ambassador and also a trustee.
And indeed, and what a fabulous organisation! What a wonderful charity to be involved in, and I can't really describe adequately how proud and privileged I am to be involved.
Well, it's great to have you with us. Let's start off at the beginning of your journey, because you wear quite a number of hats. You've got your civilian career and also a military career and now a charity career as well. Just give us an overview of the things that you've done.
My goodness me, yes. I celebrated my 56th birthday in April, and that milestone, if I can put it like that, coincides with 40 years since I started to take money for writing stories. I was still a schoolboy. I was a football mad schoolboy in Inverness, and I had pestered the editor of the local paper for a job, because in those days there was, there wasn't the proliferation of media studies and journalist studies courses in colleges that there are today. There was one place in Scotland that did journalism, and as you can imagine, the competition was very fierce. So I thought I would just circumvent that process and get a job at my local newspaper. And I pestered this poor man by phoning him and turning up on his doorstep. And he was always, to be fair to him, he was a great old guy called Willie Wilson, who was a journalistic legend in Scotland in the 70s and 80s. And to be fair to him, he always took my phone call. Even though he always said, no, Mike, look, you're too young, you're too inexperienced, you need to go to college, da-da-da-da-da. And then one day I phoned him and he started to say all this, and then he went, hang on. Our sports reporter's going to have to move over to the news desk to do maternity leave cover. So actually, there is a bit of a vacancy. Come and see me tomorrow. So the next day I went to see him, and that night, I was covering local football matches at the public park in Inverness, the Bucht Park, and it wasn't the sort of Fleet Street Pulitzer Prize winning job you'd imagine, because there were 8 games on at the same time. So it worked that way. And I was still 16 years old. I was still at school. I don't think I'd sat my O grades, and I was getting paid to write about football, which I loved, and that got my foot in the door.
And from there, you had a career in newspapers, and then that led to radio, and then that led to TV. And I suppose the difference between being on newspapers and radio to being on the TV is that all of a sudden that your face gets recognised and you start becoming a bit of a local, if not national celebrity, which is a different side to it all, isn't it?
I'd go out for a beer and people would come up to me in pubs and stuff. And that wasn't why I got into television. That was a byproduct, which, after a little while became just what happened. But, being recognised was so what. I wanted to work in television because I wanted to work on the stories. I wanted to be right at the point where these stories were happening, and I did. And the fact that people would come up and, want an autograph or more recently a selfie was irrelevant, really. And people didn't, I don't think, and why should they, I suppose, understand the hard work that's involved. I think they think that it's just about being on TV, which it's not. It's absolutely not. And I remember I used to do a lot of court reports because in newspapers I'd covered courts, and I knew my way around, which the news desk at Scottish Television loved, because I think they thought, because I was a little bit older than everyone else, a little bit more experienced, I was a safe pair of hands to put on these big, legal, complicated stories. And I remember outside the High Court somewhere, standing there and doing my piece, and it was, from memory, a couple of minutes, no notes, certainly no autocue. And this guy came up to me and he said, I thought you'd have somebody to do all that for you. And I said, how do you mean? He said, well, do you not have like an autocue or a guy holding like idiot boards? And I said, no, mate, I write it and I memorize it. He said, I don't believe you. I said, well, and he stood and watched me do it. And I said, no, there's nobody else. And I think people, and I'm sure you're the same, Ian, in radio, that people don't really quite understand. And, why should they? And people would come up to me and say, Mike, where do you get your clothes? And I said, well, Marks and Spencer's mostly. Where do you get yours? No way. Presumably you've got a designer who designs your clothes for you and all this kind of thing. I'm thinking, you've got no idea. Who does your makeup? And I said, I don't wear makeup unless I'm in the studio, which is very seldom. And just people just, yeah, but as I said, why should they? They don't understand. They want you to tell them what's happening in a minute and a half and then go home.
Yeah, often the facade of TV and things like that is far more exciting than the reality, isn't it? It's just that's how it is.
People used to say, with the glamour of television, I said, I promise you, I absolutely promise you, the presenter in the studio, he or she, they're glamorous. They do get makeup. They do get wardrobe. I work out there, out in the rain, out in the mud, and in Scotland, it's in the winter, it's a pretty tough job.
Absolutely, but not as tough as going out to areas of conflict, because you became involved in the military and are still a serving reservist with 27 years experience. Yeah. How did all that come about? What was that path, and how did that begin?
It's interesting. You say that, having had that milestone birthday just 6 weeks or so ago. I realised how I am now in my last job in the army, because you retire at 60. So that was another milestone. So yes, it came about because, and I'm in no way, absolutely no way, comparing myself to my father and grandfather. They were called up to serve in the First and Second World Wars in the Royal Navy. And I never met my grandfather, but my father used to tell me all his stories. And because all his friends had served in the war, I was surrounded by these men as a young boy, and I used to sit absolutely wrapped by their stories. And I think it was inevitable, because it was a huge part of my father's life. He served on the Atlantic convoys in the Royal Navy, and the privations and some of the things he very seldom spoke about, actually. But I was inured. It was just absolutely, absorbed by me as a child. And when I got the chance, I remember sitting watching a football match on TV, and the ad break came on, and one of the adverts was come and join the TA, as it was. And I thought, you know what? I've always wanted to do this. And I phoned. There was a number on the screen. I phoned the number there and then. And the guy said, how old are you? And I said, I'm 29. He said, you're very lucky, because we close at 30. And that was it. So I just got in, and just under the age limit, and joined the army, or the TA as it was, at 29.
Wow, and that took you on some key conflicts of fairly modern history, really, in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, and obviously the realities and I guess the horrors of what goes on in these places quickly comes home to you.
Yeah, I've seen life and death. Yeah, I've been all over the world with the military, and that has been a huge privilege. And to to see the sun come up on Mount Kenya and stuff like that, and meeting people in all over the world, and seeing, some of the most fantastic sites geographically, and wonderful people, but also the downside, I suppose, although at the time it was very, very much something I wanted to do, was the conflict. And it was, very sobering. And I had joined in 1994 at the age of 29, and I thought the Balkans War was happening, and I thought, without question, the British military, whether it's part of UN forces or NATO or whatever, may well become involved. And if I'm in, I may well get called up. I may well get mobilised. And I thought, well, okay, if you join the reserve, there's every chance that will happen. But it didn't. And then the Kosovo War started, and that was in 1999. And I was a 5-year veteran by then. And I thought, well, there's every chance, like some of my friends, there's every chance I could get mobilised to go to Kosovo. In the end, I went to Kosovo as a journalist. But I thought, there's every chance I could get mobilised here, but I didn't. And the Balkans, obviously, that conflict continued at varying levels for several years, and I wasn't mobilised. And then the Twin Towers disaster on 9/11, that happened, and I think the American military retaliated within hours with airstrikes on Afghanistan. And I thought, given the enormity of this and the impact and the spread of the impact, i.e., this is global, I think there's every chance I will be mobilised for this, having not been mobilised for the Balkans, having not been mobilised for Bosnia and Kosovo. I can't imagine I'm not going to be mobilised for any kind of response to 9/11, and I was. And then not long after I returned from Afghanistan, a very similar call came to go to Iraq. And I as I'm a 56-year-old man now, I sit and ask myself questions about why I volunteered for both of these conflicts. I wasn't mobilised compulsorily, I volunteered, and I sometimes just sit and pinch myself, to say, what on earth were you thinking of?
And what a difference from reporting as a journalist, because if you're part of a press corps, clearly your job is there to report, but then being there as a reservist, was it a thing in your mind perhaps that you had to actually, kick yourself into gear, that look, I'm here to fight now, not to report?
No, those are two very different hats. And as soon as you put a military uniform on and pick up a weapon, you are a different person. You are a soldier. And I didn't need any motivating to do that. That was my job, and I knew, I knew what was happening, and it was a totally different mindset, a totally different world, and a totally different outlook and viewpoint. And they are so binary. It's there was no thought needed, really. Just something you did.
Tell us about some of the things that you were doing on deployment out in Iraq, first of all.
I was there right from the start, and unusually I did my service different from a lot of soldiers. If you look at or service personnel, if you look at their medals, you generally see the Iraq medal, then the Afghanistan medal, and then all the others. My medals, it's the other way around, because I served in Afghanistan first. But in Iraq, we started in Kuwait, and we waited, and then we deployed into the desert, and we set up the part of the British 1st UK Armoured Division, which is fascinating to see a wartime division set up, ready to go. And I've got goosebumps now talking about this, Ian. I will never forget that moment when, on H hour on D-Day, okay, moving out, and the whole division just moved and punched into Iraq. And I showed you, it never leaves you. Look at my arms, blimey. I was working obviously for a British division, and we moved north to basically take, although we didn't do it immediately, take Basra. And then we moved in such a way into the desert that the Americans, the Marines, could do what's called a passage of lines. They basically crossed through us and headed on up the main supply route towards Baghdad, because in that kind of expeditionary warfare, you don't really win until you take the capital and overthrow the leader, who was Saddam Hussein. Now, that didn't happen for some considerable time. And because obviously the American military was huge by comparison to us, to our expeditionary force, and they had the means and the materiel and the men and women to go and keep going up to Baghdad. And we took Basra and we stayed there. And I went no further north than Basra.
And how did that compare with your experience in Afghanistan in terms of the things that you were doing there?
I was working in the headquarters. Actually, in Afghanistan, I was working with NATO. And I was working in the headquarters of ISAF, the International Security Assistance Force. And at that time, ISAF, which was a NATO formation, was led by the Turkish military. So my work was for, yes, it was for ISAF, but it was actually for the Turkish. I was working for a Turkish command, and my immediate superior was a Turkish Navy commander, and it was a real League of Nations. I had a New Zealand Air Force wing commander in my team. I had Greeks and Swedes, and it was a fascinating experience. But I was basically working in the NATO headquarters in Kabul whilst I was in Afghanistan.
And so really that experience you've talked about of being a reservist and serving in some of those conflicts that you've mentioned, and your other life as well of being in the media and on the news and being a news reporter and I suppose working in PR really, which is sort of what it is. Are great skills that you bring to the Erskine Veterans charity now as both an ambassador and a trustee.
I don't mean to be blowing my own trumpet, but I think I give Erskine 2 or 3 different inputs. I was the main carer for my mother, who had a diagnosis of dementia, and I was able to, bring that experience to the table. Also, clearly, being in the media for all those years, there's a bit of a poacher turned gamekeeper kind of relationship there that I can see things coming and I can spot things that are useful to know for the charity. And of course, I'm still a serving reservist, so I've got I have if I can put it this way, I've got 3 fingers in the pie. So hopefully, to mix my metaphors, that will cover a few bases.
And coming from a military background, were you well aware of the Erskine Veterans charity through that? What was your introduction to the Erskine Veterans charity?
Yes, I think anybody who is involved in the military, or indeed not, if you're living in the west of Scotland, you'll know Erskine is the town that's on the south bank of the Clyde, and of course there's been a bridge at Erskine over the Clyde, probably for 50 odd years. But the name Erskine was synonymous with the Erskine Hospital, which started in 1916 and cared for men who were wounded in the First World War. And they've grown and grown, and their role and mission has changed radically in the subsequent years. So I was aware of it, and more than once, and this was in the 90s, STV, Scottish Television, sent me there to do stories. And the media being the media, if there was let's say an anniversary of, and I think in this case, this would have been 1998. So that was what the 80th anniversary of the end of the First World War. And I was sent to Erskine to go and interview some veterans. And it was just, it struck me later, it certainly strikes me now, maybe more than it did at the time. But I was speaking to men who had been in the trenches and who had lived through the horrors of that war. And we see it now on Pathé film and black and white footage, and all the rest of it. But these men were actually there, and remarkable men to listen to. And I'm so glad, I'm so proud, and a privilege now, as I understand more and more now, that I had met these men and I was able to tell their story, or they told their stories. I was able to facilitate that. And that what a remarkable privilege. And thankfully, all these interviews are recorded and they exist. So hopefully, in 100 years' time, people will still listen to these stories and learn from them. I think is probably the most important thing. So I used to love being sent to Erskine, and my news desk were quite happy to let me do it because nobody else knew anything about the military. So because I was in the reserve, or the TA as it was, they were quite happy to send me.
And you were the main carer for your mother and later mother-in-law, both of whom died after a diagnosis of dementia, which you alluded to earlier in our chat. How important a part did this play in your charity work now?
Yes, I think that I retired. Basically, I knew that my mother's situation was deteriorating rapidly, and she needed care that was constant. She lived with us, but she needed care. Um, she needed to be fed. She needed to be toileted. She needed to be washed. She needed stimulation. She needed to be spoken to. She needed someone to hold her hand and talk to her and listen to her. And I thought, there's only one person who I would want to do that, and that's me. So I was very fortunate that I was in a position that I could basically just retire and look after my mother. And yes, I mean, over the last months, and I had nearly a year with her before she passed away. I had 9 months with her, constantly round the clock, and it was just wonderful to be able to do it. And I thanked my lucky stars at every opportunity that I had the capacity and the time and the opportunity to do it, because a lot of people are working, a lot of people have families, a lot of people have children, a lot of people live thousands of miles away from their loved ones. But I was able to just drop everything and focus on my mother. And it was during that time that I realized that my life had been, up until that point, all about me, about my career, um, about being on the TV every night with the big story. I didn't want to have the fourth lead or the fifth lead. I wanted the lead story because I just wanted to be where the news was happening. My life was about me in the army, about getting that next promotion or getting that next course or doing that next trip, whatever. And it was about trying to get another book published and writing another book and getting it published and getting it out. I wanted to be doing all these things. And then I realized that suddenly my life was now not about me. It was about, well, first and foremost, my mother, and then charity work, because I realized that I could hopefully, I hope, help any number of other people by my experience, by my knowledge of the media, knowledge of the military, knowledge of dementia, and I was able to, I hope, cover a whole lot more bases than just concentrating on myself.
And you are not just an ambassador, but a trustee as well. What's the difference for someone who's not fully aware?
The fact that I'm speaking to you today, I'm speaking to you as an ambassador. Mm-hmm. Being the trustee's work is behind the scenes. It's about the management of the charity. It's about the business. It's about the scrutiny. It's about the running. It's about the the sort of back shop, if I can, back office running of the organisation. And obviously a lot of that, particularly the financial stuff and the corporate stuff, is confidential, and it's something that you don't really hear about until after it's happened, or you may not hear about it at all if some things, some projects happen or don't happen. And of course, recently, and I started as a trustee with Erskine almost exactly a year ago, it was all COVID related. So that was the sort of back office stuff. which tends not to be publicised for very good reasons. The ambassador role, which I've only just started, is totally different. That's very overt. It's very, out there. It's about social media. It's about spreading the good word of the charity and what it does for so many different people. It's for, I don't know how much for how much longer my image will still be out there, where people would still know the name, know the face, know the voice. So for however long I'm able to, I'll be shouting from the rooftops what a great place Erskine is and what a great job it does for great people.
Mike Edwards, it's been fantastic speaking with you. Thanks for joining us and telling us a little bit about your career on the TV, the radio, in newspapers, and of course in the armed forces, and now what you're looking forward to with getting involved with the Erskine Veterans charity too, as a trustee and as an ambassador. Before you go, can you give us one song, one of your personal favourites to play on Erskine Veterans Radio?
I've got hundreds of favourite songs, but I think if I was pushed and told I have one, I would like to hear, I think it is my favourite song, Given Everything. I'll Find My Way Home by John and Vangelis. It's haunting, it's beautifully worded lyrically, it's fantastic, it's a fabulous melody, and it's just two very, very clever, very, very talented musicians, and it just makes me happy and sad at the same time, and it's a wonderful